Hello, juniors. This is Mrs. Steiner Trimble commenting upon a PowerPoint created for you by Mrs. Bollock-Ernie. Unit 5 of our Ethics and Morality course, and this unit is all about freedom, human action, and happiness. Mrs. Bollock-Ernie chose for you an image, a clipping, from Raphael's famous painting, School of Athens, which depicts many of the philosophers of antiquity, especially Greek philosophers. And here in the very central part that Mrs. Bollock-Ernie has snipped out for you, you will see on our left, wearing purple and red, Plato, who dates from around 428, 430 BC. And to our right, in gold with blue, his student Aristotle from about 384 BC. So as we begin the unit, let's talk about the kinds of things that we'll be discussing. We will return to our discussion of freedom, the discussion we began when we were reading Gaudium et Spes, the Vatican Council II document. And we'll delve deeper by reading some of Pope St. John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae, which he wrote in 1995 and subtitled On the Value and Inviolability of Human Life. Inviolability means cannot be violated. So that'll give you a clue about where we're going with this discussion. We're going to focus on the part of the document which contrasts civil law with moral law, contrasts and compares civil law with moral law, and discusses how moral law impacts upon civil law. And then we will also be talking about what makes up the morality or immorality of a human act. Object, the act itself, circumstance, and the end or intention. And we'll unpack some moral dilemmas and discuss the principle of double effect. That'll be a pretty interesting discussion. Students generally enjoy talking about those what-if kind of scenarios. And then we'll wrap it up by coming to an understanding that doing what is right, just, and moral, choosing good and rejecting evil, which is the basic tenet of morality, leads to virtue and to happiness. The first unit, of course, will be about freedom. I love this quote from the Catechism. Freedom is the power rooted in reason and will, the two components of rational nature, reason, and will or intellect. Freedom is the power rooted in rational nature to act or not to act, to do this or that, and so to perform deliberate actions on one's own responsibility. On one's own responsibility. That harkens back to what John Paul II said, St. John Paul II said in Fides et Ratio about what makes a person an adult. Can you remember that comment? Is freedom a license or permission to do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want? Indeed, it is not. Freedom is a gift from God, bestowed upon the rational nature, human nature. And its purpose is to allow us to perform or to act morally, to choose good and to reject evil. Authentic freedom lies in our ability to overcome our potential enslavement to our impulses, emotions, and reactions. Remember way back in the first two PowerPoints, in the very first unit on natural law and faith and reason, we talked about what an emotion is. An emotion is a spontaneous inner reaction to a person, place, or circumstance. And emotions bear no moral charge. They are neither positive nor negative. They are neither right nor wrong. They are neither moral nor immoral in and of themselves. It's really what we do with our emotions, what decisions we make, and what actions we perform that give us morality. It does not have to do with our emotions, and therefore we need to be able to employ our intellect and our will to overcome our impulse to act or react on pure emotion alone. Rational nature is necessary for freedom. Now, I think there's a kind of a side conversation that you might want to have with your pod later on in the morning about whether other creatures other than humans, other animals specifically, could actually be truly free. They have no rational nature. Could they be truly free? Or instead, are they merely wild? Components of a rational nature are those necessary for freedom. Reason or intellect attains proper knowledge of the action itself and attains proper knowledge of the goodness or sinfulness of the action. So with our reason or our intellect, we come to understand what it is that we're going to do or decide, and whether that doing or decision is a good thing or a sinful thing. And then we have to exercise our will in order to desire to perform that action, either because it is good or despite our knowledge of its sinfulness. Those are the two components that are necessary for us to use or employ the freedom that God has given us. If our will desires to do an action or engage in an action, despite the fact that we know with our intellect that action to be sinful, then we perpetrate an abuse against freedom. Take a minute in your pod and see if you can get as many possible fillers in for the blank in the statement at the top of the slide. The abuse of freedom might result in, now go round robin. What do you think? Go. Thank you. It could result in a lot of negative things, couldn't it? Here's a quote from Aristotle in his work called Politics. For man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all, since armed injustice is more dangerous, and he is equipped at birth with arms, meant to be used by intelligence and virtue, which he may use, instead, for the worst ends. Wherefore, if he has not virtue, he is the most unholy and the most savage of animals, and the most full of lust and gluttony. Having just finished the mission, this quote really brings to my mind all those images from the end of the movie, when taking the cardinal's injunction that the mission had to be closed, all the missions to the Guarani had to be closed, Senor Cabeza oversteps and perpetrates true savagery upon the native peoples and upon the missions and all the wonderful work that they had done. And also how the Jesuits themselves, some of them, the Jesuits themselves, employed their freedom in choosing savagery as well. And the whole thing literally exploded. Further on abuse against freedom, further insight. The improper use of freedom leads to self-destruction. Did anybody say that in your round robin? Take abuse of freedom to its far end, and it will lead to self-destruction. The person ends up being a slave to his passions in such a manner that freedom is reduced and can be virtually lost. Here I think specifically about the age-old trouble of addiction, whether that's addiction to a substance or a behavior, like maybe giving vent to my anger. I could have an addiction to just whenever I feel angry, I could be allowing myself to give vent to my anger such that I eventually lose the ability to edit myself. I lose the ability to keep myself from venting my anger and just spouting out and striking out whenever I feel anger. And at that point, self-destruction, the destruction towards others, of course, can happen, but also self-destruction. And I think we saw a lot of evidence of that in the movie of The Mission as well. And I will confess to you that I personally can relate to that. That's something that I've had to struggle with, given my upbringing, my background, and my personal sinfulness and my personal weaknesses. Freedom can be reduced or virtually lost if we abuse our freedoms. The misuse of our freedom robs us of our dignity and causes us to fall short of true happiness. It robs us of our dignity and causes us to fall short of true happiness. You know, I think we've all seen movies or images, or maybe even have personal experiences where we've witnessed the loss of dignity, or we ourselves have experienced the loss of dignity because we misused our freedom. That's basically what drunkenness is, isn't it? It's the loss of dignity at the hands of the abuse of freedom. There are several potential obstacles to freedom which can diminish or lessen our guilt or culpability if those obstacles to our freedom keep us from choosing good or rejecting evil. Obstacles to freedom are different than abuses against freedom. Abuses are volitional or willful. I know things are sinful. I choose to do them anyway. Obstacles to freedom are different than that. They usually don't happen because I have willed them to happen. And the most common of this obstacles of freedom would be ignorance or a lack of knowledge. Ignorance is not the same thing as stupidity. Ignorance just means I do not know. There are two kinds of ignorance, and one of them diminishes my culpability if it causes me to reject good and choose evil, the opposite of what I should be doing. There's vincible ignorance and invincible ignorance. Vincible means conquerable. So if I have vincible ignorance, I lack knowledge, I do not know, through my own fault or choice. I don't want to know. I fail to investigate. I will not search for the truth or seek the truth. Now, vincible ignorance, because it is my choice, does not diminish my guilt, usually, if I sin in employing that vincible ignorance. And it can usually be rectified. It can usually be changed because it's conquerable by its very definition. I can conquer that ignorance and my situation can be changed. My ignorance can be changed. But the other kind of ignorance is invincible ignorance, not conquerable ignorance. And it constitutes a lack of knowledge that is not one's own fault and that therefore cannot easily be rectified or corrected. And if I do not know and therefore I fail to seek the good or reject the evil, and I had no way of knowing, then that does diminish my culpability or guilt in a given circumstance. Inadvertence is not exactly the same thing as ignorance, but it is similar. Inadvertence means not paying attention. I do know, but I don't pay attention to the truth. I've heard the truth before, but I don't give it the credence that it is due. It's inadvertence. And inadvertence could be not so much on purpose. Or it could be, if it becomes really willful, then it becomes vincible ignorance. So you see how they're related. A couple of other obstacles to freedom: duress and fear are closely related, and it's important to distinguish between the two. Fear is when I am afraid of an imminent threat, an immediate threat to my safety or to the safety of someone that I love. Fear is not the same thing as dread. Dread is of something that's coming in the future. I dread an impending bankruptcy. Somebody has threatened me that if I don't do something, they will hurt me, and they've given me 24 hours. That's dread. But fear is the immediate. In the immediate, I am afraid that somebody is going to hurt me right now because they are pointing a gun at me and they're in the room with me. That's fear. And that can be an obstacle to freedom that diminishes guilt if it chooses me to reject good and to choose evil. Duress is when we're operated on by an outside force, and that keeps us from employing our freedom for choosing good. I'm thinking of an example that is actually very common in war-torn second and third world countries, where people, especially young people, will be captured and forced to become soldiers, not for the legitimate military of that country, but for informal or guerrilla forces, maybe under a warlord or a drug lord, perhaps, or some other, guerrilla force. And very often those young people are drugged and kept drugged and brainwashed and indoctrinated and forced to do heinous things, often to one another, forced to kill other prisoners, and taught and manipulated into that kind of soldiering. And that is extreme duress. That would be an extreme obstacle to their freedom to choose good and reject evil. And it would very much impact upon how guilty they would be counted for the things that they do. A couple of other obstacles to freedom or inhibitors to freedom are inordinate attachments. Now, these are a little different than habits. Habits are customary to our way of doing things, but they are still under our control. And so if I have a bad habit and it tempts me or inclines me towards choosing evil instead of good, that is still under my control, and it does not diminish my freedom. I'm still guilty if I act on my bad habit. However, once my habit becomes extreme and it becomes an addiction, it can be an inordinate attachment. Inordinate means oriented away from the good. So oriented toward evil or oriented toward that which is immoral. My inordinate attachments, my addictions, are no longer under my control. And so if I'm addicted, I no longer have freedom. Addictions are inordinate attachments. Habits can be either virtuous or not virtuous. Our good habits are virtuous. Those are called virtues, our good habits. And our bad habits are called vices. If I tried to go a day, 24 hours, without praying, without prayer of any kind, entering into my mind or my heart, I don't actually think that I could accomplish that. Prayer is such a habit for me. And it is a virtuous habit because it is a choice for the good. It's a movement toward the good and a rejection of evil. I would say that my habit of prayer is not completely under my control anymore. It is an ordinate attachment. It is oriented toward the good. It is an ordinate attachment. It's a very good habit, and it's an extreme habit. I can't break it, even if I try. But I do, unfortunately, sadly, have other habits that are negative habits. And those are vices. And if I allow those to become addictions, and they are oriented away from the good and toward the evil, those are inordinate attachments. Inordinate attachments can diminish my culpability to a certain extent. Of course, I'm still guilty for having allowed my habit to become an inordinate attachment. But habits are still within my control, and therefore they do not diminish freedom. So let's go back to this abuse against freedom slide. This is the exact slide you saw before with Aristotle there, asking you, the abuse of freedom results in, what do you say? Go back around your circle and say first in your pod that which you said before, and then decide, after having talked about this a little bit more, if you can add to your answer or if you would like to change your answer. The abuse of freedom results in, go. Thank you. I think that even Aristotle, although he was not a Christian, he predated Christ by centuries, would say the abuse of freedom can result in unholiness. The abuse of freedom can result in savagery. The abuse of freedom can result in self-destruction. The abuse of freedom can result in evil. The abuse of freedom can result in diminished human dignity. And I'm sure you have some other really good answers as well. Let's think what Bishop Barron would say. He's hearkening us back to Gaudium et Spes, discussing what is authentic freedom. Hence, man's dignity demands that he act according to a knowing and free choice that is personally motivated, comes from within, interiorly motivated, prompted from within, not under blind internal impulse, not just a reaction to feelings, nor by mere external pressure, not by habit. Really, he's saying we should resist duress, fear, inordinate attachments, all of those external pressures, all of those obstacles to our freedom. We are still demanded by our human dignity to resist those. Man achieves such dignity when freeing himself, emancipating himself from all captivity to passion, he pursues his goal. And his goal is to choose good and reject evil. Only a free person can make correct choices and carry them through to completion. That's what it says in your morality textbook. Law makes the achievement of good first possible and then effortless. So laws give us the kind of guidance that help us to structure our choices and that make choosing good and rejecting evil possible. And then because they become ordinate attachments, good attachments, extremely good habits, always oriented toward the good, they become effortless. And that's where we'll stop for today.